Well, we have been working through, as Robert said, these kind of lists of sins that we kind of feel like are not a big deal, right? Like you saw from the bumper video there, like when you got to homicide, that got kicked out because that's actually bad. Like that's a big one, right? But there are certain things that are in our culture and especially in our churches where we're just kind of like, everybody kind of dabbles in that. It happens. People do it quite often. And so it's really not that big of a deal, whereas we categorize some things as like, oh, that's really bad. But kind of what's so dangerous about that is that sin damages our relationship with God, right? Like all sin damages our relationship with God. And so I think that, that it's really sneaky to kind of think, well, these aren't a big deal. These are somewhat acceptable sins. And I think really that's kind of the devil's approach, is to get to see some of these things as just not very important. In fact, the one that we're talking about today, as Robert said, we're talking about greed. And I think it's one of those that, we just kind of don't think is a big deal. But Jesus actually says it's the number one thing that's vying for our allegiance that should be to God. Like that's kind of a big deal. That's pretty serious. And maybe Jesus was so concerned about warning us about this one because he knew the damage that it causes. It can cause people to completely burn out in life. It can cause people to ruin their marriages, ruin their friendships. It can make people ungrateful. It can make them unhappy. It literally can put people in prison, and also people end up deep in debt because of it. So this can be a very serious issue, and it can cause a lot of problems in our lives. And so this is one I think also that we have a really hard time seeing in ourselves because it hides under some really, really great motivations. Right? Like, hey, I just need to provide for my family. I want to give my kids, a better situation than I had when I was growing up. Or I'm just trying to prepare for what might come up, what might be down the road. I'm just trying to be prepared. Is that a problem, right? And I love this quote by Johnny Bird from a couple of weeks ago on this subject. He said, "Greed likes to sneak into the planning meeting." And I think that is so well said, right? Because, the Bible is totally good with planning and being smart and thinking through and foreseeing things that could come up and being prepared for those. The concepts of working hard and planning well, those are biblical concepts. Like, there's nothing wrong with being smart and planning and working hard. Like, all of that is fantastic. But all of a sudden, greed kind of sneaks into the planning meeting, and all of a sudden, it's not really just about those things anymore. It's saying things like, hey, we need more. We need more. Or generosity can wait. Or, it brings a spirit of discontent and complaining instead of a spirit of gratitude and faith. And so it shifts the conversation from God being our security and what we trust to possessions and money being our security and what we trust in. And it's subtle. We don't even realize it. Like we literally went from just trying to think through what we need to do and plan ahead and that kind of thing to all of a sudden transferring our trust from God to transferring our trust to possessions and money. And we don't even realize that that's happened. And so I think that this is really hard to see in our lives as well. Because of the culture that we live in here in America. The American dream pushes us to spend money we don't have to buy things we don't need to impress people that we don't really even like. It's really true. And everybody is doing that. And so if everybody's doing it, it can't possibly be that big of a deal. And that's been ingrained in our culture for a long time. Literally somebody a long time ago, obviously, when you're going to hear who said it, asked John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, how much is enough? To which he replied, a little bit more, right? It's just a little bit more. And there's obviously nothing wrong with doing well in life and that kind of thing, but it is it's got to be a little bit more. I'm still not quite where I need to be. I'm not content yet unless it's a little bit more. And that's the problem with greed, is it can't be satisfied. It always needs a little bit more to enjoy, more to hoard, more to feel secure, more to feel like you've arrived, more to feel like you have the influence that you would like to have. And it just doesn't stop. So what is greed? I think right up front we should probably define it. And really with the best I could kind of boil down was this definition: greed is the assumption that it's all for your consumption. That's kind of the idea. It's the assumption that it's all for your consumption. It's what you need. It's what you want. It's there for your purposes, whether you're spending it, whether you're putting it on a credit card, whether you're saving for the future, still you're saving because it's for you. And so it's this concept that it's all for my use and for my needs. And so this is why we never feel like we quite have enough. It's interesting that just that attitude itself gives you the feeling that you never have enough. This is why we struggle to live a life of generosity, because our default is to assume that whatever comes in is for us to use on us. And so because of that, like, we end up using it all up. I heard, one person say that the way that you can tell if you have a problem with greed is if you never feel like you have anything extra. And you would think, well, why would that mean you don't have a problem with greed? Things are just tight. Well, again, that mindset of it's all for me causes us to actually end up using everything, or assuming that, hey, I don't have anything extra because I need this for the future. And so therefore we just continually hoard, or we continually spend, and we just kind of fill out our budgets, and then we say, I don't have anything extra. And the reason that we have that feeling is because of that assumption that it's all for our consumption. It causes us to really kind of take an undisciplined attitude toward money, and we end up being driven by our wants and our desires. And before long, money really controls us instead of us controlling our money. And that's why God cares so much about this issue. God doesn't so much care about that he wants your money as he doesn't want your money to have you. That's what he really, really, really cares about. And God actually takes this issue really seriously and is pretty jealous about it, because money does tend to have us sometimes, and God's really particular about what controls us. He kind of thinks it should be him. And so that's why Jesus in Matthew 24 says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Like that, literally, of everything that could be mentioned in our culture. First of all, you would think that the obviously antithesis of God would be the devil, so you can't serve God and the devil. Okay, so that would have made sense. He could have said God and sex. Obviously, culture has always been, infatuated, with wrong ways to be involved sexually. And so, there could be all kinds of things he could have said, but he chose to say money. Jesus says the number one thing vying for our allegiance that should be going to God is money. And so Jesus gives us this amazing picture. I love this. In Luke chapter 12, he gives us this amazing picture, this story that he tells in reaction to something that somebody asked him. And he's in the middle of talking and just teaching, and somebody from the crowd just throws out this question, and you can see it up on the screen. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide my inheritance with me." And I love Jesus' response. He says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Jesus just acts frustrated, and then this just cracks me up. This guy just blurts this out, and you have to think about who Jesus was culturally. Jesus was not he didn't have any official position. There was no hey, I think that if I could ask Jesus, Jesus could decree something, and then it would have to be done. He was kind of a self-made rabbi. He didn't even come up through the formal system of making a rabbi. Literally, the only authority he had was because what he said was so profound that people were flocking to him to listen to him. That was his authority. He didn't have any cultural authority. He didn't have any position to where he could weigh in on this and just say, well, you need to divide that inheritance, or we're at least going to go 60-40. I decree it. Let me sign it, And so this guy literally is just putting him on the spot, really for PR purposes. It's okay, this guy's a super popular teacher, and if I ask this and he says, yeah, that doesn't sound fair, my brother's going to be super embarrassed in front of the whole village. So it's really going to put the pressure on him. And that's all he's really getting out of it. And Jesus just reacts and just says, man, what in the world does that have to do with me? I just love that. It's just first of all, the guy had to be super disappointed that he takes this shot. He takes his shot publicly in front of everybody that's listening to Jesus, and Jesus just goes, what does it have to do with me? It's oh, okay, this is not going like I thought it was going to go right up front. But then it gets worse. Because in verse 15, he says to him, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And so Jesus doesn't really like say, yeah, your brother is greedy. He should split this with you. He doesn't really talk about his brother's heart. He kind of calls out his heart. And he basically is saying to everybody there, this squabble is over money, and it shows that it's what matters most to these guys, even more than their relationship. I mean, it's just like, he just calls it out right there. Then he says, watch out for all kinds of greed. And I think it's really interesting that he says that. When it says all kinds of greed, there's times that the Bible says things like or all types of malice, and I'm like, well, how many types of malice are there? I don't know. But he says all types of greed, and I think it's really clever that he says it because there are all types of greed, right? I mean, greed can be I'm hoarding for the future and I'm keeping it, or it can be I'm spending to the point that I'm in debt. It can be all kinds of different things. And what's funny is that we all are super judgmental about the people who have the other type of greed, aren't we? If you're a hoarder and you see somebody who ends up in a lot of debt, you say, well, shouldn't have been greedy. You got a real problem, right? Or if you're a spender, and because you're a spender, you don't ever have anything extra, like there's nothing left laying around, so you're super judgmental at people who have a lot of money and don't seem to be making enough difference in the world. If you had money, you'd be making a difference in the world. Of course, you don't have money because you're greedy and you spend everything you have. So, it's just interesting, right? Like we all are judgmental about the other person's type of greed. And there's different types of greeds. And then look at what he says in verse 16. Then he launches into this parable. And you ever wonder what Jesus was going to teach on? Like, what were we going to get if this guy hadn't asked this question? We don't know. But he says, the ground of a certain rich man, yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? The planning meeting just started, okay? You're now in the planning meeting. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Legitimate question needs to be asked. Glad we're having this meeting. And then he says, this is what I'll do. The guy starts talking to himself. And he says, I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And then he's not only talking to himself, he's planning for what he's going to say to himself. I love that too. He says, then I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And you see what happened there? Like greed slipped into the planning meeting. Like you got to have this meeting. You got more grain than you can deal with. Like can't leave it out there and let it rot, right? So you got to have a meeting. So we got a planning meeting going on. We're talking about what are we going to do with all this? Legitimate question. And then he says, hey, like I want my family to be taken care of. I need to plan ahead. Like again, legitimate meeting. And then I'm sure nobody in the crowd expected what Jesus says in verse 20. All of a sudden, they're just like, wait a minute, like the guy has too much. He's just planning on what to do with it, right? And so Jesus says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is going to be demanded from you, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? What? Like what? Like the crowd is like, he's just trying to like plan and take care of his family. Like what just happened here? Like why does God have a problem with this guy's plan? Now, some people in our culture today would say, well, he has a problem because this guy has so much money and other people don't have as much money. And that's not justice, and so therefore that's a problem. But God actually doesn't care about the fact that some people are doing better than other people. What God cares about is what our attitude is. God cares about whether or not we're generous. And so the problem is not the fact that he's got too much and that just shouldn't happen and other people don't. The problem is, you notice basically what he's saying is he slips from again the planning meeting and greed slips in and says, hey, yeah, you got to do something with the stuff that you've got, but dude, you're set for life. Look at what you're going to be able to do with this. That is great that you're storing it up. And the key words for Jesus at the end of that sentence are for yourself. He just stepped in to the assumption that it's all for his consumption. That God blessed him for him to just have it all to himself. And that's the problem. The problem is not that he has a lot. The problem is that he believes that everything God gives him is for him. And that's when things went off the rails with those last two words. Never asking, why has God blessed me with so much? What does God want me to do with what I have? What are God's priorities and how I handle what has come in? Not understanding the idea that he's a steward of what God has given him. He's a steward of God's resources, not his own resources. And not praying, hey, God, show me the needs of other people around me that I could help with. And then Jesus finishes up this parable and he says, this is how it's going to be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now, Jesus says this is how things are going to be for who? For people who store up things for themselves. Again, the same concept, that the assumption that it's all for my consumption. I don't think he means that everyone who gets greedy is going to die that night. I don't think that's what he means. Like, this is how it's going to be. You know, you'll know if you're greedy because you'll wake up dead. That's how you'll know. Like, but you know, this is why Jesus says in Matthew 16:16, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can someone give in exchange for their soul? It's that serious, right? That this has become this person's focus, and this is how it's going to be. Jesus says that you're going to miss the eternal value that God has for you because of this focus that you've got. And so he says, instead of doing what this guy did, we should be rich toward God. Like, what does that mean? Rich toward God. What does that mean? It means seeking first his kingdom. It means putting his priorities, his agenda, his plans first. It means we need to kick greed out of the planning meeting and we need to put God in charge of it. It means being more focused on knowing God more intimately, more than we are in getting the things that we have our eye on. It means laying up treasure in heaven. It means finding your meaning and your identity in Jesus and not in money. Money and the things that they can buy, that doesn't bring meaning in life, right? They might be a means to some meaning, but it doesn't bring meaning. And so Jesus tells this guy, he says, life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. I mean, that is like literally, we ought to write that out, put it on a Post-it note, and stick it to the dashboard of our car. So that as we're headed to work that day, or we're headed to a store, like, hey, listen, just a reminder, life doesn't consist of the abundance of possessions. I mean, we think, well, yeah, that's, I mean, obviously, right? Like, life doesn't consist of but we kind of act like it, right? We kind of do. We kind of act like that thing that we're saving up for, or we're hoping to get, or that next thing that we want to get, like we got to have that as much as we need air. Like, that's kind of how we act sometimes. You know, you can kind of see that. Like, anybody know anybody who's still carrying like an iPhone from like 4 generations ago? Like, yeah, okay, yeah. Like, you probably get comments, right? Like, you got an iPhone 8, you got one with a button on it. Well, you still got a phone with a button on it. Like, what, you know, like, people like act like, like, oh, well, I mean, that kind of shows me where you are in life, you know? And it's like, is that what I'm about? That's who I am as a person? Is because my iPhone's not? Yeah. I mean, literally, we act like that, you know? We use phrases like, well, what do you think he's worth? That's a terrible phrase. That's a terrible question. What do you think he's worth? The answer is the blood of Jesus. That's what everybody's worth, right? I mean, that should be the only answer. But we literally say, what is he worth? What is she worth? That's a terrible question that we have in our culture. How sad it is to base our identity and our worth on something that we will 100% lose all of. That's the question that Jesus is asking here. He's saying, then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And the answer of 100% of the time is somebody else is going to get it. Somebody else is going to get it. Some of it will be like in your lifetime. Some of the stuff that you literally have sold your soul for, you will sell in a garage sale for 1/10 of what you paid for it. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself at a very deep discount? Somebody else. Somebody else. But in the end, all of it. You prepared it for yourself, and somebody else is going to get it. So what are we supposed to do about this issue? Well, many times, like I said, we don't even know that we stepped into greed. So that's why I think what I'm about to say is so important, because we need to practice this whether we think we're greedy or not. Does that make sense? Because it sneaks up on you. So you don't know. You don't know that you're about to become greedy, or you're about to act in a way that is greedy. And so we really need to focus on what Paul says here in 1 Timothy 6, I think, He's in the middle of a conversation. He's talking about people who think that godliness means financial gain. So in their culture, they had kind of this mindset. I can't understand it. I haven't seen anything like this in our culture, that where they think that if you're wealthy, then God likes you extra special. Or they think that if you're godly enough, God's going to bless you financially. And so, I know we don't have any problem with that in our culture, but that's what he was talking about at the time. And so in verse 6, he says, no. Instead, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out. So again, this kind of answers Jesus' question, who's going to get, what you prepared for yourself? Well, you're taking nothing out, so not you. That's who's going to get it. And he says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. That if we have food and we have the clothing, we have the basic needs, we have shelter over our heads, like that we can be content with that. And he says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap into many and foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And so you look at that and you go, well, a lot of people, would like to be rich. Like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean that, like, if I've ever said, man, it sure would be nice to have $1 million, like that's me? I think what it's saying is that when you've structured your life, that's your main goal, that's the thing that you're focused on, that's what you're going after, that's your focus, that you're setting yourself up for a lot of pain in life. And then he says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. We all grew up saying that love of money is the root of all evil, but that translation actually is not quite right on that one. Hate to tell you. That this is actually really correct to the Greek. It's the root of all kinds of evil. Like, people have lied and it's not been for money, right? People have committed adultery and it's not been for money. People have done a lot of things, it's not been for money. It's not the root of every evil, right? It's the root of all kinds of evil. People have lied for money, committed adultery for money, stolen, so this is really true to the Greek here. All kinds of evil. And it says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs, which I just think, man, he talks so much about that if your focus is to get money, that's what you care about, you're crushing yourself, you're killing yourself, you're going to hurt yourself in all kinds of ways. And don't we just take the opposite view? We just think more money would solve everything, right? And Paul's saying, well, if that becomes your focus, like, more money can be nice, it can be helpful, that kind of thing. But if it becomes your focus, you're in for a world of hurt. But look at this formula, and this is what I really want you to focus on. The first thing he says is we need to focus on godliness. That should be the first, that should be the main thing. We tend to think of this as like a passive characteristic. Like, some people are just more godly than other people, right? That's what we think. Well, that person, man, he just seems so close to God. It just comes naturally to him. But that's not true. It's something that we should focus on. Godliness is the pursuit of God. It's seeking his kingdom first. It's investing in your relationship with God as your first priority. And until we really value that and living for God over everything else, money has a very good chance of possessing us. And we may not even see it coming. And so that needs to be our first focus. That this godliness, that pursuit of godliness needs to be our first focus if we want to avoid money running our lives and being our God. The second thing is contentment. Again, we think of this as a passive characteristic, right? Like you may have had a couple of kids or several kids that you raised, and one of them just always seemed real content, and the other one seemed like they always needed more and were taken from the other kids, that kind of stuff. And so we just think, oh yeah, some people are just more content than others. But this is something, I think that this is a function of a practice of thankfulness and praise and gratitude. When we're intentional to spend time thanking God for what he's given us and praising him as our provider and acknowledging that we can trust him even if at the moment things don't look great, like we just sang, then we will become more content. It will help us take our eyes off what we don't have and put it on what God has provided in the ways that God has come through in the past. And as a result of that, we're going to have more and more of a heart of worship. You can't worship and envy at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. Well, actually you can. You just can't worship God and envy at the same time. You'll worship something different. And then the last thing is just lay up treasure in heaven. And I just think it's so interesting. If you think about these passages that we've just talked about, you see this whole concept that like life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions. You're going to leave it all behind, yet lay up treasure for heaven, be rich toward God. You see the same lingo being used in all these passages. So let's skip down to verse 17 in the same passage in 1 Timothy 6, and it says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share, and in this way. So he just gave you the formula to lay up treasure for yourselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. I think most of us check out at the very beginning of verse 17, command those who are rich in this present world. Oh, well, I'm glad Paul's talking to those people, because that's not me. So, stick it to them, Paul. Yeah, tell them. Yeah, I hope Timothy gets those people told. And most of us we would have to be very, very, very rich before we would say, oh yeah, I'm rich. Because, as Rockefeller said, just a little bit more. Yeah, I'm not rich yet. Just a little bit more, and then I'll be rich, right? But throughout history, really, just to be honest with you, the concept of being rich really kind of boils down to having extra. That's it. That's it. If you have extra in your life, you're doing well. You're wealthy. But we don't feel that way, right? Because at the end of the month, the money's gone. But again, the money's gone because we have the assumption that it's all for our consumption. And so it's not there, right? It's not there, but that doesn't mean we don't have extra, right? If you've ever upgraded a phone that works, you have extra. If you have several streaming services, you have extra. If you've ever traded in a car that works for one that you like better, you have extra. If you're not determining if you're going to eat, but where you're going to eat, you have extra. Now, all those things are fine, right? I'm not saying, just stop trading in cars and don't eat out. And I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is acknowledge that that Paul's talking to us, because we have extra. Many people on the planet throughout history have not had the luxury to make those same decisions that most all of us are able to make. But look at what Paul tells us. He says, first of all, tell them not to be arrogant and put their hope in wealth. It's really close to what Jesus said, right? Like, that life is not about your possessions, and it's not that we that we should trust in and trust in those possessions, because it certainly doesn't help us, right? It doesn't get us anywhere to do that. But then Paul says, instead, put your hope in God, because we can trust Him to provide. And then he says, tell those who are rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. And he says, by doing those things, we'll be laying up treasure for ourselves for eternity. Again, very similar to what Jesus said, lay up treasure for yourselves in heaven. The thing that breaks greed and selfishness, which greed is just a type of selfishness, isn't it? Is to pour ourselves out and love other people, whether that's through serving or whether that's through giving. And he literally lists both in here, serving and giving, serving and giving. He says that's what's going to break the selfishness and the greed in your life. And I love that he lists both, because and you can't substitute one for the other. And I think we do that sometimes. I think we substitute the one that we gravitate towards for the one that we struggle with. Right? Because what we'll do is say, for instance, like you're doing very well financially and somebody mentions something that, hey, we need $1,000 to make this happen. And you can say, you know what, I can do that. Write the check. But then they say, hey, we need somebody to come out on Saturday and be involved in help, ministering out in the opportunity that we have with this festival out in the street. Well, my time's worth a lot of money. I don't really have time for that. Oh, it seems like maybe that's your thing. Maybe that's the thing that's going to help you break the selfishness and greed in your life, is for you to go and humble yourself and serve that way. But then you flip the tables. Like if money's tight for you, you might say, well, I serve, but when they ask for money to help with this or to make this mission happen or whatever, no, I can't do that. I don't think I could do that. And so it's interesting, like we struggle with one or the other typically. And so he lists both and says that's what it's going to take to lay up treasure in heaven and to break greed in our lives. And so we really need to do both, but we really need to focus on the one that we find the most challenging between those two. Paul says when we do that, we actually take hold of the life that is truly life, right? That's the opposite of what Jesus said, where the guy had the attitude that his life was found in the abundance of his possessions. It's like, hey, he's going to come up empty, but this is life that is truly life. So when we start pursuing godliness, that means, if you're here and you don't have a relationship with God, it's got to start there. Like none of the stuff that we talk about ever at any of our campuses is just a checklist for you to start to try to obey so you can impress God. It doesn't work that way. It's not like that you're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to start working on greed in my life and then maybe God will accept me. No, it starts with God has already accepted you through what his son did on the cross. You turn to Jesus, hand your life over to him, and as a result, God begins to do these works in your life. And so it starts with that godliness. You got to have that relationship first. You can't pursue godliness without a relationship with God. And then we focus on him and we begin to see how much he's blessed us and we become more and more grateful and content. The natural reaction should be to pour out our resources and our lives into the things that matter for him. And so that's kind of how this thing works. But here's the problem. A lot of us have a relationship with God, but we don't just seem to have a heart to want to do that. Like we don't want to just be generous and pour out our lives and serve and give. Like that's just not natural. And this comes back to something we just sang. When Gary sang the song, and I don't even remember the lyrics, but basically he said, I'm going to sing these words until I mean them. You know how often the Bible talks about doing something before you feel it and then the feeling coming later? And that's why Jesus says in Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. See, it should be the opposite. Like, well, what I care about, that's where I invest, right? So where my heart is, that's where my treasure will be. No, he says where your treasure is, your heart will follow. And I think we've all experienced that. So there's times where as a Christian, you don't have that heart. You're not passionate about it. It doesn't work that way that, maybe we're not pursuing godliness maybe like we ought to. Maybe we're not as content as we ought to be in worshiping God for what he's already done in our lives. And so therefore we don't have the heart to lay up treasure in heaven. So Jesus says, start with laying up treasure in heaven. Just start. Just start by being generous. In my own life, I've experienced this, and some of you have as well. Maybe there's something that you started investing in because you felt like you should, and then you got a heart for it. I'll give you some examples. I sent both my kids to the same university. I've made my last payments. She's in her last semester. The youngest one's in her last semester. It's been 8 straight years at the same university. I've sent literally my flesh and blood, which is my treasure, and I have sent my money, a lot of my money, to that place. Do you know that on Instagram, I like the pictures that talk about what the golf team's done? I don't even care about golf. I'm very excited about that university now. I'm a huge fan. I wasn't necessarily. It was kind of like we were just trying to decide where to go, with the first one. And now we're just like, hey, we've been there for 8 years. I'm very excited. I'm a big fan. What happened? I sent my treasure there, and now my heart's there. I mean, literally, my kids will be gone next year. I'll probably still drive up for 2 football games. That's what happened. I sent my treasure. Some of you have done that with mission trip. You've been like, you know what, sometime I ought to go on a mission trip. Go on a mission trip, what happens? Oh, you spent your money, you spent your vacation time, went down there and invested directly in people, and now you're crazy passionate about it. See how that works? Sometimes it starts with, hey, I'm just going to get off the ball and I'm just going to start investing in eternal things. And when I do that, then my heart begins to follow. Then it kicks off, I care about godliness. I care about contentment. I care about laying up treasure in heaven. Some of you have had a relationship with God. And at one time you were really, really passionate for him. And maybe that feeling has waned. And Jesus says one sure way to gain more and more of a passion for God and the things that God cares about is to be less controlled by your money and to live a life of generosity and invest in eternal things. It's a hard step to take. It's got a hold of us. We don't see how it has a hold of us. And between what Jesus said and between what Paul said in 1 Timothy 6, it shows us the way for money to be a means to make something amazing happen in our lives and for all of eternity, as opposed to money being something that controls us, runs us, drives us literally to the grave, at which point it leaves us. And so Jesus says that's not life. And Paul says generosity is a life that is truly living. Let's pray. God, first of all, thanks for caring about this, to the point that you're willing to talk about this issue, honestly, more than heaven and hell in Scripture, because you know that this is something that controls us. You know that this is something that runs our lives. You know that the pursuit of it and it being the main things in our life, honestly, it just really drives us, as Paul says, towards being pierced through with all kinds of difficulties and pains and heartaches, and it stresses our marriages. Man, it just, so many things that it does that they're just crippling. And yet it's so alluring. And yet it just seems like all we're doing is just trying to plan. All we're doing is just trying to provide. All we're doing is just trying to prepare for the future. And it just sneaks in and comes alongside and changes our motivations in those planning meetings. And so, God, I just pray that you would help us. Help us to submit to you. Help us to seek you first. Help us, God, to make that the main priority. And when we don't even feel like it, help us to just get started like we've talked about here at the end. God, I pray for anybody that doesn't have a relationship with you. I just pray that, first of all, that they would understand that you are an extremely generous God, that you went out of your way when they owed a massive debt, a debt that could not be paid of sin. You went out of your way to give your own son to die in their place, perfect, sinless Son of God who came to earth as a man, connect with us, live right alongside of us, and live a perfect life. And yet die in our place because the wages of sin is death. He didn't owe that wage. But he paid it for us. God, that's a generosity that's overwhelming. It's amazing. And really, like, as we look at that, we just come running to you and we just say, you know what? There's no better use of my life than to lay it at the feet of Jesus and hand it over to him. God, you are so worthy of our trust because of that. Help us, help anyone here that hasn't taken that step, but help those of us that have to not lose focus on that, to not get sidetracked, to how worthy you are of all of our trust in every area, including this area of how we handle our finances. Break us free from the assumption that it's all for our consumption. We pray in Christ's name.